morning, everyone.
So as some of you know, we are Dan and Kara Kensinger, and this morning Heath asked us if we would share about foster care. And part of that is because of our story, which we wanted to share with you. So our plan is to be able to share about this and then have questions at the end. So you can be thinking of questions while we're speaking. We also are going to be staying pretty general and not speak specifically about the child that we are currently fostering, just because we know that this is getting aired publicly, and so just wanting to respect our kiddos' privacy and their story, because it's their story to share someday. So our story with foster care actually started during the time that we were dating, which was 8 years ago now. And we both actually, it started with talking about adoption. I actually have two siblings who are adopted, who are older than me, and another sister that I have. And so obviously when we were dating, discussing, what were each of our visions for a family someday, and definitely connected on that. So when we decided that we were ready to start a family, we started looking back into adoption when I was actually pregnant with our daughter, because we figured it was the safest time to look into everything, because we couldn't do anything about it. So that way we kind of were buying ourselves time.
We would have adopted like 20 kids during the conversation. So we knew that, but most of the time you're not allowed to adopt if you're pregnant.
Yeah. So while we were looking at everything, we were looking at overseas adoption, domestic adoption, talking about people we knew who had adopted through both processes. And then we came back to foster care and realized that there are a lot of children in need in our own community, and realized that it is a fraction of the cost to do adoption through foster care versus overseas or even domestic adoption through an agency. And so we both just felt like, okay, we're not sure when, but this is definitely going to be a path that we felt like God was going to take us down. So fast forward, our daughter turned 2 in August, so it was about last fall after she had turned 1, and we started talking about we feel ready, maybe there's another child to be added to our family. And as we were kind of having those conversations, I had a conference that came up, and I just felt like every time I turned around, I was given information about foster care. I was running into people who wanted to talk about foster care, and I was like, okay. So I gathered the information, we talked about it, and I emailed one of the organizations, and they were like, yeah, because I emailed them on it was Wednesday or Thursday, and they were like, yeah, we have an informational meeting on Monday. Like, okay. So we went to the meeting, and I think we had to wait 6 weeks. They had their next training. And so this past December, we had training through the organization, and then we were officially licensed in March of this year. And then it was end of May when we actually had our first placement in our home.
It could have been sooner, because I think we got 3 emails within 2 weeks for kids needed to be placed.
Yeah. And with the organization we go through, you get a lot of choice and discretion in that, because they give you a little blurb about kind of the situation, the age of the child, all of that, because they work really hard to find the right home for these kids. They don't like that statistically foster kids get moved. I think it's 15 to 20 different homes during the time that they're in foster care, and we didn't like that statistic either. So the organization we work with, they work really hard to find the right place for these kids. But the idea of foster care is not a new one, and we wanted to kind of dive into biblically, what God has to say about that. And one of the scriptures that definitely has impacted us in this process is found in James chapter 1. It's verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world?
Well, the Bible is jack-packed filled with references to foster care. Specifically, a lot of the code words they use are fatherless, the widows, and the needy. At the time of the Hebrews, your tribal identity was hugely important. It set your economic, religious, and political identities for your entire life. So the idea of being displaced was potentially catastrophic and could be fatal. And so the Bible is filled with references to the displaced. The orphans, the widows, and the foreigners are the three displaced categories that appear most commonly. The New Testament and the Old Testament have numerous references to these. There's a passage in Deuteronomy that deals with this specifically. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. Additional passage in Deuteronomy addresses the tithes that many of us learn in Bible school. You're supposed to give 10%. Back in the Hebrew world, that was a legal requirement. And every 3 years, they would take those tithes and divide them amongst these groups to assure that they were fed and had everything they would need. So remember that each Sunday when you're passing the tithe plate around. The origin of this was to make sure that the widows and the orphans were to be taken care of. And there's also some New Testament passages. I believe Matthew 25:40 is the next one. Truly I tell you, whatever you do for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. This is telling because can you imagine a group that is more vulnerable and susceptible to harm than children that have been taken away from their parents? Today, those are truly the orphans and widows we're talking about, because foster care is not only addressing the needs of the child, but also the needs of the parent from whom the child has been taken. And I believe we have a reference to John. Is that the next one we got? All right. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so also you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And this is demonstrating, it's one of 142 references in the scriptures to caring for orphans and widows. And so today we are going to go over all 142 with a detailed exegesis to address how that is relevant to today. We're going to talk a little bit about what the early church did to expand, and that was directly linked to how they were fostering children in need. While I was doing some of the research on all this, it was fascinating to me that I discovered some of the major figures in the Bible were foster kids. I hadn't thought of it before, but Moses was a foster child. Esther was a foster child adopted by her uncle Mordecai. And I can make a pretty good legal analysis under Levitical code that Jesus himself was a foster child. But we're not going to do that today. But let's talk a little bit about the Acts church. Jesus had just left. Pentecost was just days ago. There's about 300 Christians in the world. And Christians were living truly in community together. They were sharing everything. They were literally having no boundaries or separations between their families and others. Christianity and Judaism were unique in the ancient world in that they did not view infanticide as a crime. And a lot of this was due to the fact that there was a sense of eugenics in the ancient world where people didn't get connected to their kids very early on because there was a very high mortality rate. And so a lot of times parents really didn't start to connect with their children until they were 4 or 5. And this was because children were just passing away from numerous causes at the time: disease, harm, war, and interestingly enough, the Romans had something called paterfamilias, which meant that the head father figure in the family actually had the power of life and death over all the members of the family until they were adults. And that continued for the daughters until they were married. And so a father could decide there's just not enough money to go around, there's not enough food to go around, there's not enough space, and they would actually kill their children. This was something that the early church was seeing everywhere. They were living around this. And particularly the Roman church was living in a community where these kids were cast out nightly. Some of the communities had fields that were solely devoted to this. They were the exposure fields. But particularly in Rome, it was such a highly populated area that these kids were just thrown out into the sewers. And so each night, the early church would go out there, and they would see the Imago Dei, they would see the image of God in these children. They would actually rescue them from the sewers and from the exposure fields. Back then, these children were left out there, and they had two options. They would either die that night, or they would be picked up by the slavers, and they would become victims of human trafficking. They would work the brothels, they would work the fields. And so the early Christian church embraced these two groups because for them, it was nothing new. This is what the Jewish communities had been doing for centuries. But what made the Christian church different was these communities were existing in the Gentile world. And so for the first time, they were truly living in these communities with non-Jews. And so they were seeing this, and nightly they were going out and expanding their numbers. And so they were saving kids from not only death and slavery, but they were bringing them into the church in a way that had never been done before. And I started looking at some of the numbers. At Pentecost, there were about 300 Christians in the world. Within 250 years, by 300 AD, they were up to 8 million. And this wasn't because people were embracing the wonderful luxury lifestyle of the Christians. These people were living basically day to day. They were sharing everything. They were going out and they were helping the poor through their own paychecks. They had a concept back in the early church that if there was anybody in your church that starved and you had food in your kitchen that night, you were guilty of murder. And so they would often, if there were people that didn't have enough food in that community, they would actually fast until there was enough for everybody to have a meal together. And so this was an entirely different way of living, the Jewish law and then the Christian policies. Today we argue so much within our denominations, theology, points of contention, infant baptism versus believers' baptism. Back in the early church, they were literally talking about implementing the gospel in a way that sometimes it feels like we may not be doing as much today. And so they truly embraced the idea of the orphans and the widows. They would adopt not only the children of prostitutes working in the brothels, but they would often care for the prostitutes themselves, and so that expanded the church as well. So for you history buffs out there, you're looking at the year 300 AD. That was a full generation before Constantine made Christianity legal. So this was before the idea that everybody just became Christians because they lived in the Roman Empire. This was a time when Christians were not only having to give up everything to support their communities and these abandoned children, but it was also illegal for them to believe what they were believing, and this was the time when they were thrown into the circuses and killed by lions. It was illegal to be Christians, and they were still willing to sacrifice so much. So it was fascinating to me to see how quickly the church expanded, essentially through foster care. And talking a little bit about the need today, and I'm looking only at Indiana alone. The number of children in the foster care system fluctuates anywhere from 14,000 to 23,000. And that has more than doubled in the past several years. A lot of you know, have some familiarity with the opiate crisis that's going on. Indiana now has the second highest rate of children placed into adoption in the country, and the second highest rates of child abuse in the country. And it's only getting worse. The director of the Indiana Department of Child Services, which oversees foster care in Indiana, both private and public, said this isn't a trickle, this isn't a stream, this isn't a wave, this is a full-blown tsunami, and the system is entirely overwhelmed. If you were to take every licensed foster parent and equally distribute the number of children currently in foster care, each parent, not couple, each parent would have over 175 children. And one of the problems we have is there's a lot of fear about jumping into adoption. And Kara's going to address a lot of these, but I kind of wanted to define some of the fears I had early on. Was the fear of raising somebody else's kid. And that's just weird. Particularly in American society, the idea of taking on those rights and responsibilities for somebody else, knowing that you're allowed to raise your kid however you want to. The idea of taking somebody that you have not raised and bring them into your home, having them around your kids if you have bio kids, your children if you've adopted any, it can be really intimidating. There's also one of the things that really affects us is the idea of having to give kiddos back. You can foster to adopt, but the idea in our foster system is that reconciliation with the parents is always the goal. Sometimes it's possible, but many, many times, and increasingly more times, it's not possible. So when you go through the process, a child is placed in your care, the parents go through and get services from the state. Classes, programs, sometimes drug testing, things to help them address the concerns that led to the child being removed in the first place. If they're working at it, the court will continue to give them opportunities to make reconciliation possible. There's also a track called TPR, which is terminating parental rights, and that's the one that usually leads to adoption. There are some parents that, for whatever reason, aren't moving in the direction where they'd be able to care for the children, and so eventually the courts can legally remove all parental rights permanently, and that's when adoption becomes an option, not just for foster parents, but also for the public institutions and the private adoption agencies. This is where a lot of those children come through the system and become available for adoption. Cost is a big issue. A lot of people think, hey, it's difficult enough to raise my own children. There are programs in Indiana that actually allow for a per diem fee to help you with those costs. And we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about using different programs or working directly with the Department of Child Services, using adoption agencies, et cetera. But there's actually some assistance for that, not only with major costs, but also each day you have the child, you actually have some financial assistance for that. So hopefully that helps alleviate some of those concerns. One of the big issues is, and it sounds horrible to say, but these are broken kids. I mean, these are kids that haven't had the sort of stable home that you may have provided for your children, or you always thought that you would provide to your children, you just haven't had the opportunity yet. That is really scary. Some of these kids are coming drug addicted. Many of them are coming from abusive situations, and that can be really, really intimidating to look at and say, do I really want to bring that into my home? Am I competent to be able to address those? And so those are definitely the things I was worried about when we were talking about this. And Carol will talk a little bit about how to address those and kind of the way that this all connects into our calls as Christians.
Well, I know part of what can help when you have a lot of concerns is to really evaluate if this is something you feel like God is calling you to. Because I know a lot of times in my life, there have been things that I'm like, God kind of plants a seed of like, hey, you're going to do this. And I'm like, no, sorry, I got my own plan. But I end up, nope, coming back around. And no matter how hard maybe going through that was, on the other side of it, I always see God's provision every single step of the way. And I heard this long ago, but if God calls you to it, he will take you through it. And it's something that I think in very tangible ways with foster care, I think it's wise to have some hesitations going into it, because there are things that if we have some of these things floating in the back of our minds that Dan has talked about, I think it can help you be more aware of them and be able to see them when they pop up. So when the child who you have in your home maybe says or does something that feels really personal, you're able to be like, oh, that's right, I don't know their full story. I haven't walked in this child's shoes. I don't know what they've witnessed. I don't know how many times that they have done that and gotten a really bad response from the adults in their life. And they have to test that out. They have to know if that's going to be true from us as well as foster parents. And so if I have that in the back of my mind, I'm a little more prepared when those moments come. And I know the organization that we work with, they do a really good job of doing trainings and have provided a ton of support. Because when we first got our foster kiddo, our daughter just turned 2, and our foster child is almost 10. And
This was not the plan.
yeah, that was, yeah. Because for obvious reasons, like that's a big age difference. But man, when that information came through and we talked about it, we both just knew we were supposed to say yes and to be able to trust God with all the other details. And there's definitely been a learning curve for us, but we also were reaching out to other people we knew, some who are here, to say, oh, what's it like parenting a child of this age? Like, I don't know, I'm out of my element. And it's a beautiful way that we get to be more connected with the people in our community as well. And so the other things that I know we think about is, instead of, I think, sometimes focusing on the impact on me, I have to remind myself, like, Am I going to be the adult in the situation and realize that I'm dealing with a child? A child, again, whose story I don't fully know, who's hurt, who's scared, who misses their parents. And there's definitely emotional and spiritual impacts that can come from having a foster child in your home, because you get an opportunity to provide them with a huge contrast of how family and a home can be different. And that's not something that's just, oh, whatever. That is huge for children. As some of you know, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I work with kids. And that's one of the things that I always try to help parents realize, even with their own kids. And maybe it's a divorce situation, so we've got kids who are going back and forth between mom and dad's house. But man, that contrast can be huge for children. It's stuff that they get to tuck away in their brain. And on the spiritual side, you and we don't ever get to know exactly how God might use that in the child's life. You know, with our foster kids situation, they haven't really grown up with, I'll say, a full-time dad. They've definitely had parental figures, but our foster kid gets to watch Dan be a dad to our daughter, which I hope and pray helps them know what that potentially could look like for them in their life as a parent. And those are the things we can't know, but we get an opportunity to be literally a part of someone else's story in supporting the parents of our foster kid and supporting them. And for me, that's been a huge honor. When I step back and realize that responsibility and that place that we get, and I'm able to take my hands off of needing to know. Because sometimes we like that tangible piece. And so part of what we've been talking about, and I feel like we keep running into with foster care and adoption as well, is the fact that it is an opportunity to step into God's plan of who God is when it comes to reconciliation and redemption. Because that's ultimately the story that God is asking us to be a part of. Are we willing to go down to those places that make us feel uncomfortable, to enter into situations with people who are different from us, with people who, we might view as broken, but in truth, we're all broken. It's just our brokenness looks different. But are we willing to go there? Are we willing to be inconvenienced in our own lives for the sake of a child? Because on a very real and human level, I know one of my concerns with foster care was like, well, what if they, break one of my family heirlooms? Things that I care about, things that I have memories attached to. And then I realized that doesn't matter when it comes to the life of a child.
Nelson Jr. is probably going to break it in a few years anyway, so.
Yeah, but for me, just having that moment of conviction of what can you really weigh against the opportunity to love someone and to be able to provide a safe and loving place for someone. Because obviously with us having a heart for adoption, we have to enter into foster care knowing that not every child that gets placed in our home are we going to have an opportunity to adopt. And through this process, realizing we're not always going to feel called to adopt. And I had to do a lot of soul searching on that and a lot of praying about that. And the place that I was able to come is that if I can provide a place for a child where they feel safe and they feel loved, that was going to be my goal, and that was going to be my focus. Knowing that, again, all the other pieces will fall into place as I'm trusting God with our family. And one of my bracelets here on my arm is actually trust, because that's the word that God has pressed on my heart that is my word this year. And it's hard. It's hard to trust when we don't always know, because we like knowing. But I feel like being able to give a child a safe and loving home is doing what the Bible has called us to do. It's also a tangible way to help keep vulnerable kids from being trafficked. As some of you also know, I have a huge heart for human trafficking. And the statistics on kids who are runaways, how quickly they get targeted and picked up for various kinds of human trafficking are staggering.
100% of runaways will be contacted by a trafficker within 24 hours in the United States. And it's particularly vulnerable for foster children. 60% of all child human trafficking victims in the United States are or were in foster care. And those are just ones we know about.
So I think for us, part of all of this is obviously we feel called to foster care. And we recognize that not everybody is, but we definitely feel like you need to know that if you have hesitations about it, but feel called to it, you can talk to us, but definitely talk to God about that, because there is such a need. And tangibly, being able to love on people is how we get to change our world in a tangible way, is that person-to-person contact.
That's the end of our program. Does anybody have any questions about foster care? Just a little bit about our experience. When Kara and I were first talking about this, we literally were talking about this on dates, because that's just the kind of weirdos we are. We were talking about adoption a lot, but I know that I don't think you really had given much thought to fostering. For whatever reason, I had. So it takes both kinds to do this sort of thing. Like, we're doing foster care now. We'll probably be doing it for quite a long time. But I grew up wanting to do it, and Kara it's not that she didn't want to, she just never thought about it. She's like most of us. I don't really know why I was thinking about it since middle school. That was something I wanted to do, but you don't have to be the sort of people that grew up thinking, oh, this is definitely what I'm going to do. This is how I'm shaping my marriage and my life. This is something that you could easily step into. There's nothing easy about it. There's nothing easy about being a parent at all. But what's surprising for me was once you choose to do foster care in Indiana, there are so many resources available to you that it almost feels easy. The system is designed to try and get you into the system as soon as possible. We've thrown words around like training and things like that. There is training, but it's not boot camp. I mean, you're going in there, you're reading a binder talking about what you're going to do in certain scenarios, helping you to learn about the foster system, putting you into the shoes of these parents so you understand where they're coming from. One of the biggest experiences I've had was learning that the mom is not the enemy in this. It's so easy to say, oh, how did somebody do this to their kids? How did they neglect them? How did they choose to do heroin instead of feeding their children that night? How could they possibly do that? A lot of these people went through foster care themselves. A lot of them have experiences that have kept them from knowing what you're supposed to do when you're raising a child. It's not like they teach this in home ec. They don't teach you how to be a parent in school. We all know that. And so some people are just going through struggles. And you realize that in this case, the bio mom with our kiddo has been a great partner in all this. We've had the opportunity to really work with her and encourage her. And she's doing fantastically. This is a woman that has struggles in her life, and she's chosen to become a good parent to her child. And our kiddo loves her. It's not this situation where they're judgmental of what mom has done. They're still mom. There may be anger there may be frustrations there, but these kiddos still love their parents, even if it could be difficult for us to understand how they can. Some of the training we've had has helped bridge that gap. They've helped us understand cultural aspects. They've helped us understand circumstances, understand addiction a little bit. Helped me. Kara has a lot of training with these sort of things, but I'm just a lawyer. I don't know these things. And so it helps us put ourselves into their shoes, and that helps encourage us every time we go into training. And the resources available, the financial assistance, the guidance, the respite care is amazing. You get to choose which kiddos come into your home. It's not a situation where you become licensed and they say, we're sending a 15-year-old from juvie to your home. They can say, hey, we've got a kiddo like that, and you can say yes or no, but we got a half dozen emails about opportunities, and Kara and I could discuss that and say, we're going to say yes or no to this one. Sometimes you feel, yes, this is a must. Other times you're like, this just doesn't feel right. With our kiddo, we knew immediately. We were like, this wasn't what we planned on. We had set parameters. We were looking at age 3 and younger, just because we had, at that time, a 1-year-old. And we didn't want things to be too disruptive. But you get a say in who comes into your home. And once they're in your house, you not only have assistance all the time, but there's visitation, so you get a break. It's not like you're always dealing with a child all the time. It's actually different than if you have your own kid because they're with you. You can't send them off anywhere. But there's an opportunity called respite care where if you're working with an organization, we use the Villages, which is a statewide organization. They're fantastic. We can say, hey, we want to do a weekend away. And so is there some way we can find another foster family to sit with our kiddo for a weekend so that we can get away? They encourage that. There's no judgment. I struggled with that. I felt very guilty doing it, but it's extremely helpful because it helps you be a better parent. And so the ability of the state and the agencies to help you through this process blew my mind. I at times during the discussions about this felt there's no way I can do this. You absolutely can. I mean, it's the ability within yourself as Christians is there, and the resources of the state and private organizations and your community are there to help too. Many people in this room helped us with our questions. We had everything planned for infant, and then we got this email saying, all right, tonight you're going to be getting a 9-year-old. And we're like, what do 9-year-olds like to do? We don't know. We have a crib in this room. We don't even have a bed set up. Like, what do 9-year-olds do? And the answer everybody gave us was Xbox. So thank you for that completely useless help, because we don't allow our kiddo to use screens, which has been the biggest struggle we've had. That's all he wants to do. But we got him playing outside now. He's doing all these things that he was never thinking to do before. He was playing, I've revealed he's a boy, sorry. They went and took like boxes and garbage and created this whole like massive fun zone that he was doing, and something he never would have done when he first came to our house. So that opportunity never been there before. And so you're getting to see these kids become themselves. And so in many ways, that's what we were seeing with our bio kiddo every day. But we just got to see 8 years into the future for it, so. There are no questions. None. Well, we are going to sit up here for another 37 minutes. Lauren.
So the Villages is the name of the organization that you worked with and went through to get into?
Yes. Do you want to talk about Villages?
Yeah, there's different options that you have. I actually have a good friend from college who, her and her husband have 3 of their own kids and started doing foster care. They do it directly with DCS, so the training and some of that's different, but they actually, when we were discussing all of that with them, they encouraged us to go through an organization. And that's been great because the organization provided training for us. They also provide other trainings to make sure that we get our hours. We both were already aware because of our licenses that we have to have continuing educational hours. The same is true with being a foster parent, but like the Villages, they offer it monthly and different opportunities, and we don't have to pay for it. We go because they want to keep people as foster parents, and also just great support. You know, I think I texted the first night one of our social workers, and we're like, what time does a 9-year-old go to bed? Because I have no idea.
He told us 11.
Yeah, he told us 11. We're like, I don't think that's true, but okay. Yeah, but they have social workers that come out. I know the Villages also provide therapists for the kids. So, I mean, these kids get a lot of support and services, same as the families. I think sometimes it can be difficult with like chain of communication just because there are so many people who are invested in these kids. But once you get into it, you kind of get this feel of like, okay, this is the person we need to contact for this, and kind of go from there. But having an overall organization that we work with has been really helpful because again, we know that the heart of that organization is finding really good placements for these kids so they're not getting moved all around. So that's partly, I don't know, is there anything else about them that you wanted to say?
Well, Kara had mentioned that most foster kiddos in Indiana change families 15 times. The average length for a child in foster care in Indiana is just over a year. So do the math there. That tends to be the people that are working directly with DCS, who, as many of you know from the news, is ridiculously overworked. And this is just getting worse. So these poor people are trying to do their jobs, but they have 40, 50, 60 more kids on their dockets than they're supposed to under their contracts. And so their goal is just to find a place for that kiddo to sleep that night. The village, though, has a...
Because they work. The Villages works with DCS.
Yeah. Very closely, but the Villages has the opportunity and resources to try and find that fit a little bit better. And so instead of 15 parents for a child in that little over a year period, Villages has an average of 1. And so that sort of stability is exactly what the kiddos need. And so they ask us lots of questions during the interview. It's not intimidating or anything. You're just talking about yourself. And so they kind of create a profile, and they custom pick the kiddos that they're sending your way so that it can be what they think is going to be a lasting fit with your family. Some kids are in foster care for just a few months. Others are in there for years. And so you get an idea from that when you're talking with the case managers to try and find what's going to work best for your family. For our kiddo, we had a sense early on that he was going to be going home. So that adjusted the way we approached it. And so that changes your expectations. It's a lot easier because I didn't know how I was going to feel getting the first placement, but I loved him by the time we went to bed that night. It helps to know, is there a chance he's going to be adopted? Yes. But when you know you're really stepping in there to kind of help him get ready to go home, you just approach it a little bit differently, and that was a lot more peaceful than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be extremely difficult to become attached to a kiddo and then have to see them go back. It's very encouraging. We're looking forward to it because we see how far Biomom has gone, and we've seen how far our kiddo's gone to heal those wounds and to get closer to each other. And so a lot of it has to do with setting your expectations, which Villages and other organizations can really help with. Yeah. Molly.
Do they just do foster to adopt, or do they do straight adoption and other services or
My understanding is they do it all. I believe their numbers are that of their foster kids, 40% of them are adopted by their foster parents. And the Villages is actually very family-centered in that if a child is going to be adopted by their foster parents, there's a 6-month period from the adoption that they give the family so that the family can bond as a family without any other foster kids in the home. Now that family can return to doing foster care, but we even talk to them of like, well, if we end up having another of our own children, they again do the 6 months after you have the baby before they would place, I would say, a new foster child in the home, because they said if you have a foster child in your home, then like having a baby is just a life event kind of thing that would happen. But they're very conscientious about that because they really want the families to be healthy and to thrive, and because they want the family to be a place where these kids feel safe, can experience family life that's much less chaotic than probably what these kids have been, or why they've been removed.
And for the Villages, a lot of the families that are there to adopt, but not all of them. There are actually a lot of foster parents in Allen County who just do short-term foster care, which is extremely needed. Because a lot of these kids are being removed because their parents were found passed out with a needle in their arm. So, I mean, they don't know what's going to happen yet. And so there's a lot of time it's called a daybreak care by a lot of organizations like SCAN, where we need a home to put these kiddos in tonight. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we just need a bed tonight. And so there's a lot of people that are called just to do that, short-term care. And I don't know if I feel called to do that right now. Probably when our kiddos are older, we'll want to do that, because that's a different approach to foster care. But the Villages does all of that. They talk with you. They find out what sort of needs you want to provide and what sort of opportunities you can facilitate, and they'll cater directly to those needs. So some people do that. Some people do just the kids that are in there. The kids aren't on the adoption track, but there are a lot of parents that go in there and say, we want a baby and we want to adopt, which is great. That's needed too. And it's dramatically cheaper than doing adoption. The Christian church for the past 20 years has really focused on international adoption, and they're just now starting to get into the track of foster care. For people that finances are a concern, if you're adopting through foster care, it's usually just the cost of the attorney and the filing fees. But if you're looking to adopt from India, it's tens of thousands of dollars. So it's just a very different approach. So whatever sort of foster parent you want to be, the villages can facilitate that.
And it's also not necessarily about, I have to have this huge house for kids. It's about number of beds. Because because our foster child is older, we had a bed, but we still have a crib. Well, it's technically an extra crib because our daughter's still sleeping in hers. But if we had wanted to, we could have set that up and have taken another foster child at this point. Now, we talked about it and didn't feel that that's what we needed to do. But that sometimes can be a concern too. It's like, oh, well, we don't have room when, well, if you have room for an extra bed, that's really what they're looking for.
Have you, looking forward, what, like, would be about the maximum amount of kids that you can see yourself placed with at one time?
We have, but haven't talked about it with each other. I don't know.
Well, technically right now we're cleared for 2. Just because of the number of beds that we have. And we definitely let them know, like, we're open for siblings, because sometimes that can be another concern because they want to keep siblings together.
Increasingly, that's a concern. So
Yeah.
if that's something you're interested in doing, tell them
Yeah.
during your first conversation.
Yeah, because we actually, when we let the villages know, like, hey, yes, we'd be willing to take this placement, then DCS actually has to sign off on it, because we actually had, I think it was in April, there was actually a 3-day-old newborn that needed a home, and they knew that he was going to be put up for adoption because they'd been working with the family for a long time. And we were really sad when we found out that we hadn't been chosen to be his foster home, but we found out that it's because he was placed in a home that had one of his siblings. And so it's understanding that sometimes doing foster care means allowing that story to unfold. Because I know, especially when you go through certain experiences, it can be nice to have someone else in your life who understands that. And so I like that they keep sibling groups together, and told Dan, you know, sometime in the future, we could be that family where we have a 2 or 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and then a sibling comes up. And like, we would definitely want to be able to provide opportunity for those kids to be able to stay together. Any other questions? Yeah?
Are there any demographic requirements for those who want to foster? For example, single individuals versus married, age demographic?
You don't have to be married. Obviously, you can be. I think we've actually met several single people who do foster care. I know there was someone who was just getting licensed, and she was younger, and so they wanted to just, because she didn't have experience parenting, they were going to have her start off with doing just respite care so that she could get a feel for having kids in her home before they do an actual placement. So again, that's also partly what we like about the organization, is they're very thoughtful on that. But yeah, literally anybody can do foster care.
That is a concern a lot of people have expressed before. With foster care, a lot of people think, well, I'm not married, so I can't do it. Or I'm divorced, so I can't do it. Or I'm gay and I can't do it. Indiana is one of the states now that by law, they have to allow you to under those circumstances. Not that long ago, you would not have been allowed to. But now, as long as you're an adult and you pass a background check and you do the trainings, they want to make sure that you're not an active criminal. They'll check to make sure that you can do this, and they'll set it up, and you'll have a kiddo pretty soon. Things worked a lot faster than I thought they would. We did our training in December. We had all our paperwork filled out within just a couple of months. Our background check was run, which everybody thought was ridiculous because with our licensors, we have to have background checks anyway. And then we had just been background checked here to work down in the nursery. So we went in there and I met this guy for the third time. I'm like, yeah, I'm here to get fingerprinted again. And he's probably wondering, like, why does he keep having to come in here and do this? Am I doing this right? But yeah, anybody can do this if you have a heart for it. And right now, because the crisis is beyond severe, they will work with you in whatever way you need them to, because there's such a strong need that if you're interested, they'll have you do it. Anything else? All right, well, Kara and I will be available for questions. You know how to get a hold of us. So if anything comes up, we're not here to recruit you. It'd be great if you did. But what we really wanted to do, Pastor Heath was asking us to do this for, was he knew that we had a heart for this. We just want to start conversations. So even if this is something that you and your family just talk about at dinner today, that's fantastic. If it's something that you want to share with others, this is how the church became what it was. Not everybody's called to do it. But if you are called to do it, this is the time to step up. So, yeah. We would like to conclude in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and our opportunity to come together as a church. Thank you for us to hear this wonderful worship music. Thank you for us to celebrate your word and to dive into how that word has been exercised in the past and how you want us to exercise it in the future. Please be with our worship band as they conclude our time here together, and please help us to start this week following your intentions for each of us and for our families. In the Son's name we live and pray. Amen.